Elsie, could you briefly share what your life looked like before you had your first insight into the three principles?
Okay. Well, Ken and I were chatting last night a little bit about this because to me, celebrating Sid's 50th anniversary of his enlightenment is an epic moment. It's a moment in history. And he came up with the phrase spontaneously about before the beginning, because this is something that very few people involved in the three principles community. I don't know that there's anyone else other than Ken and myself that knew Sid before he had his experience. And so we knew him when he would talk about his own insecurity in life and so on. And it brought alive again for Ken and I where we were in those early days. Speaking for myself, I was an unhappy teenager that acted out because of my unhappiness and lostness. And I ended up, I met Ken and fell in love with him. But in my lostness and Ken and his insecurity, our relationship was rather contentious. and and so there was anxiety on my part, insecurity, depression increased, and we got married young. I was 17, going to be 18 in a few weeks. And so on one hand, even though I loved my husband and I had a child early and I loved my child, I still felt caught up in life circumstances and as if I'd had no opportunity to grow, to become Elsie. It was like I became a wife and a mother before I fully realized who I was and what I could be in life. So I felt rather trapped by my circumstances. And and I did the best I could, given the circumstances and my state of mind. And so, knowing Sid and seeing his relationship with his wife, Barb, and that they were also caught up in life circumstances. And then this incredible change in him when he had his experience, that when he first came to our home about 3 days after his experience to share the wonder that had occurred, the miracle that had occurred for him, he just was glowing. And his relationship, even in that time, that brief time of 3 days, his relationship with his wife was enhanced. And he was tender and caring toward her in a way he hadn't been before. And even though Ken and I were really frightened by what we saw in him, by the beauty we saw in him, we were frightened by that. But we were also, underneath the fear, curious about what could have happened to this man and the relationship with his wife in such a short time. And so that was kind of the first time we saw that a change in someone and the feeling of that change could transfer to someone else, meaning us, even though in our fear, we didn't know what to do with it. We were taken aback. It struck us. We could see that something had happened. And that change underneath the fear was appealing to us.
And what was your first insight?
Well, after about a year and a half of increasing fear and frustration and anger directed at Sid because of his happiness. It's like, how come you can be so happy and your relationship can be enhanced and I'm still where I'm at, angry and depressed? And what's that about? And so I would tell Sid, like when they would come and visit, don't talk to me about what you found. I don't want to hear any more of this nonsense. And I got increasingly confrontational toward him. And what was so annoying is that it never bothered him. my contention, my frustration with him, my anger with him seemed to amuse him a little bit. You know, he just had such an understanding of human nature. And he understood where my anger and fear was coming from, that it just floated above him. It didn't bother him. And I could see that. And it frustrated me, but it also aroused my curiosity because of my own anger. Like, how could he not get angry when someone else got angry with him and confronted him and called him arrogant and other things that I won't say? Like, how could he not get angry with me? And so there was a point where, sort of at the end of my rope, I saw them driving up my driveway. And again, I thought, this is just unbearable. I can't bear to see them in my depression today. I had never felt such angst. And here they were driving up my driveway. And I knew, because of past experiences over the last year and a half, that they would come into our home with grace and with love. And I couldn't bear it. And so I hid. Suffice to say that something made me come out of my hiding spot and call out to them as they were about to leave. And once again, in my fear, I got angry with Sid when he said something so beautiful to me, because he saw the fear and angst in my face, and he put an arm around my shoulders and gave me a cuddle and said something so profound that to this day, 50 years later, when I think about the words he said, I still am deeply, deeply moved, because he said to me, dearie, you have God within you, as does every soul on this planet, and you'll be okay. And I couldn't take it. I just couldn't take that. And I basically opened the door for them to leave. When they left, to make a long story short, ended up having my first insight that came in the midst of fear, that told me then, and has increased over the 50 years, that you can have an insight whenever. You don't have to be in a state of meditation. You don't have to be in a beautiful state of mind. You can be in fear and you can still have an insight, because that's what happened to me. In the midst of fear and angst came this incredible insight: thought creates feeling. And all of a sudden, my angst vanished. I'm not a believer in things vanishing. Sid would talk in that year and a half about, if you heard, if you had an insight, your life could change in a moment. And I just went, oh, Sid, please, get real. This is reality. Things don't change in a moment. They changed in a moment for me when I had that insight. As Sid used to say, if you hear beyond the words, I heard beyond the words. Thought creates feeling. And I came alive. Something shifted in me and I came to life. Something that I'd been seeking all along, when I used to think in my darkest days, is this all there is? Even with the love, conditional love I had for my husband and my children, I felt incomplete. I felt there was something missing in my life. And I used to wonder, what could it be? I had a religious background. There were moments when I found peace of mind, but it wasn't frankly to do when I was in like the rituals of my religion. It was to do when I was in a chapel, in a convent on my own, where that spirit stirred inside and I felt peace. I didn't know where it came from. I didn't know what it was. But in that moment of insight, I came alive and I knew what it was, that there was something within me, that something within that Sid had been talking about for a year and a half, and I hadn't heard until I heard from within myself. I didn't hear it from Sid, although he certainly primed the pump. I heard it from within myself.
How has your life changed and your practice changed since gaining a new understanding based on the three Ps?
I found real love. You know, although, as I said before, I love my family, my husband, my children, uh, my siblings and mother and father and so on, it was conditional. They had to do right by my standards. And if they didn't, then my love was diminished for them. So it was definitely conditional. After this insight, just spontaneously, I loved more deeply. It wasn't dependent on my children's behavior. You know, they could come in from school and leave their dirty boots where I would stumble over them, you know, throw their lunch bucket on the floor, their jackets on the floor, and I wasn't jumping all over them right away. It was like I would pick it up and put it away. I would say, come on in, I'll get you a cookie and a glass of milk. It's like I just loved them. And I didn't even realize I was doing that until after the fact. You know, there was like a gap, a time lapse where my behavior changed because my love had deepened. It was no longer so conditional. And then after the fact, I sort of noticed that, well, I guess because the kids pointed it out to me. They'd say, Mama, you're nicer to us now. And I thought, oh, you know, it gave me pause. And same with my husband. Like he would come home from the mill, the pulp mill where he had worked with Sid. And I wasn't upset with him because he'd come in again with dirty boots or ripped coveralls or something. Like I was just happy to see him. You know, it didn't matter his behavior in that way. The circumstances didn't matter. I just fell in love with my family. And I'm going to add, I fell in love with myself. That insight changed my perception of myself. I no longer blamed myself as much as I had before because I understood where it was coming from. In a way, I saw thought as sort of the culprit. I could see that my state of mind, if I was in a healthy state of mind or well-being, my thoughts were healthy and my behavior was healthy, my life was healthy. If my state of mind was poor, my thoughts likewise were poor and my behavior was poor, and so on and so forth. I began to see how thought worked. I began to see the role of thought in life. And so it took away the blame and the judgment. It brought deeper understanding and gentleness for myself and consequently for my family, and then for my clients. From a homemaker, I then began to have a practice of helping people. I became a coach and a mentor, sort of through no fault of my own. It was because people started to respond, like Sid would invite me. That was part of my on the job training. After I had that first insight, Sid began to ask me to accompany him on some of the retreats he'd been asked by the doctors, the psychologists to do. And he would say, I'd like you to come along, Elsie. You can learn from this. And I'd like you to talk and share what you've learned. And I was terrified because I had no training, no background. And Sid said to me, just talk what you know, share your insight. But Sid, I've only had one insight and I can say that in 3 seconds. And then what? And he said, just trust that when you share that insight, more will come from within you to share. And I found that to be true. But I still went through that early fear and insecurity of having to face an audience. And I went through it. I went through the fear and I shared my insight. And I remember, I'll never forget this either, that the first time I shared was in Eugene, Oregon. And after I blathered my way through, what came out of me to the audience is, I found a way to be happy. Because that's what the insight gave me, was a way to be happy without external circumstances changing. Like my external circumstances didn't change. I changed from the inside out so that my circumstances looked different. And so when I began to travel with Sid, or when the psychologist came to the island, I started to become known. People were drawn to me, were curious about what had happened to me. And I slowly began to have a practice. So it's like, I've often been asked over the years, like, how did you start? Well, I started from nothing, same like Sid. Sid started as a welder. He had that profound experience that gave him the certainty and the wisdom and the faith to serve. And that's what happened to me, is I developed a practice simply by being who I became, driven by that insight. And as I began to work more and more with clients, the thing that was clear to me, because as my circle widened, I got a lot of corporate, organizations, and they would send people to me. And the people that came to me thought they were coming to have their problems talked about. And so that was the first thing I learned, because that's what Sid taught us. When we would get together as a group here on Salt Spring, he'd say, don't talk about your problems. Don't talk about what's wrong. Talk about what's right. And I got that. And that's how I worked with my clients, is they would start to tell me what was wrong in their relationships at work or whatever. And I would gently intervene and say, that's not what I'm offering. I'm not here to talk about your problems. I'd like to hear what's right in your relationship with so-and-so. You've been telling me what's wrong. Let's pause for a moment and see if you can find something that's right in your relationship with that individual. And so we'd sit quietly, and inevitably they would find something that was right in their relationship, and we would build on that. And then there was one point, and I'll just share this one last thing, that as time went on, I shared more and more and with a wider audience. And Sid could see that I was dwelling a lot in what the principles do, what each principle did. And he called me over to his home one day for tea and said, dearie, And he said, I've been saying this to all the other people that I talk with. You want to move beyond what the principles do. He said, that's helpful. But he said, there's another deeper level where you want to talk with your clients about the nature of the principles, what the principles are, not just what they do. And he didn't say much more than that, poured me the tea, that kind of thing. And then we just talked about family, whatever. But honestly, it was within a day or two of that a client, a VP of operations of a global organization called me. And they were in the midst of downsizing, and he was bereft at having to let so many people go. And he said to me, Elsie, he said, I know it's about my thinking about this and my state of mind, but he said, right now, that's not helping me. Do you have anything else in your bag of tricks? And I thought, And I recalled Sid's words about the nature of the principles. Now, I didn't really know what to say about the nature of the principles. And in my not knowing, what came out was, if I ask you what the nature of the principles means to you, what would you say? And he paused. And he said, the word spiritual comes to mind. The nature of the principles feels spiritual. And that's where our conversation went. And he left that conversation a different person, as did I.
How do you see this understanding changing the field of mental health and our understanding of the human spirit?
One of the first things Sid said to Ken and I is that these spiritual gifts he'd found, because he didn't call them principles until some time later, he said, these spiritual gifts I've uncovered have the power to change the fields of psychology and psychiatry and to alleviate humanity's suffering. Well, I thought that was the most far-fetched expression I'd ever heard. But as time went on, I could see that was true. And he began to talk about this understanding being a cure for mental illness, that at the heart of the human spirit is mental health, not mental illness, that everybody is actually enlightened, they just don't know it. And later on, as time went on, and he kept saying that this is a cure for mental illness, and to focus on the mental health that is innate in individuals, I could see, and I also discussed this with some of the early psychologists, that for Sid, who was not in the field of mental health, for him as a novice to say that there is a cure was extraordinary, was truly a defining moment in history. Because not only was he saying there's a cure to mental illness, it was coming from a novice. It was coming from someone outside the field of mental health. That's extraordinary. That's epic.
Thank you so much, Elsie.
I'm so proud to be a part of this celebration of Sid's 50th year of his enlightenment. Thank you.